Three men on a giant tricycle, a surreal world with no rules and no limits, and a comedy show that, at its peak, pulled 15 million viewers every week and produced 5 chart-topping pop singles in a single year. The Goodies ran for 9 series between 1970 and 1982, 76 episodes. Over a decade of the most anarchic, inventive, and occasionally completely insane comedy British television has ever produced. And then the BBC buried it for 36 years. But here's what most fans don't know. Behind the giant kittens and the tandem bicycle and the funky gibbon lies a story far darker and more surprising than anything the show ever put on screen. 3 men who left the BBC for triple the money and paid for it for decades. A chart hit that was banned by the very network that made the show famous. A lead who was hospitalized 3 times for clinical depression. And a death on a quiet Sunday morning in April 2020 that reminded an entire generation exactly how much the Goodies had meant to them. Stay with us, because the real story of the Goodies is more surprising than anything that ever happened on that tandem. Fact 1. All 3 had met at Cambridge. The Goodies did not come from nowhere. Tim Brooke-Taylor, Graham Garden, and Bill Oddie all studied at Cambridge University, where they became involved with the legendary Footlights Performing Arts Club. Tim Brooke-Taylor was president of Footlights in 1963. Bill Oddie and Graham Garden followed him through the same club. The 3 men who would eventually become the Goodies built their creative relationship in the same Cambridge rehearsal rooms, performing the same kind of anarchic comedy that would later define their television work. Before the Goodies, they worked together on BBC Radio's I'm Sorry, I'll Read That Again, a show that ran from 1964 to 1973 and developed the comic chemistry that the television series would later amplify to 15 million viewers. Fact 2. None of them were actually like their characters. The 3 characters in The Goodies were clearly defined stereotypes. Tim played a posh, conservative, upper-class royalist. Bill played a scruffy, left-leaning rebel from Lancashire. Graham played a bizarre, mad scientist. In real life, none of them were remotely like their characters. Graham Garden was not a mad scientist. He was a qualified medical doctor. Tim Brooke-Taylor was not conservative. He has said directly that the only reason he played the Tory was his double-barreled name, and Bill Oddie was not a violent rebel. He was a pacifist, an ornithologist, and an active environmentalist who spent his later career presenting wildlife documentaries. 3 men played caricatures of themselves that were almost entirely invented, and the audience loved them for it. Fact 3. They had 5 chart singles in 1 year. Here is the fact that most people under 50 don't know about the Goodies. They were a genuine pop act. Bill Oddie wrote music throughout the show's run, and the songs featured in episodes regularly crossed over into the actual pop charts. In 1975 alone, the Goodies had 5 hit singles in 12 months, an achievement that put them alongside the biggest pop acts in the country that year. Their biggest hit, The Funky Gibbon, reached number 4 in the UK singles chart, spent 10 weeks in the charts, and earned the Goodies an appearance on Top of the Pops. It also reached number 79 on the American Billboard Hot 100 after receiving heavy airplay on the Dr. Demento radio show in the United States. A comedy television show had a genuine top 5 pop hit. This was 1975, and apparently anything was possible. Fact 4. The BBC banned 2 of their singles. For all the success of The Funky Gibbon, the Goodies had a complicated relationship with BBC Radio, the very network that had helped launch their careers. 2 of their singles were banned by the BBC. The reasons varied, but the pattern was clear. The corporation that employed them on television was simultaneously refusing to play their music on radio. Bill Oddie has referred to this directly in interviews, treating it with the mixture of bemusement and resignation that characterized his relationship with the BBC throughout his career. The network that gave the Goodies a platform also spent years quietly limiting what they could do with it. Fact 5. They left the BBC for triple the money. In 1980, the Goodies made a decision that would define the rest of their television careers. After 8 series with the BBC, they left for ITV. The reason was straightforward. ITV offered them 3 times the salary. They were also promised more lavish production values and greater creative freedom. The BBC, which had been dithering about commissioning a new series, found itself outbid. The move paid off immediately in financial terms. The ITV series was indeed more expensively produced, the goodies were paid significantly better, and the final series aired in 1981 and 1982 to perfectly respectable audiences. Subscribe if you want more, there's plenty more where this came from. Fact 6. The BBC refused to show repeats for 36 years. When ITV cancelled The Goodies in 1982, the show effectively disappeared from British television, not because audiences had forgotten it, not because the episodes no longer existed, but because the BBC was still furious that the trio had left for a commercial rival 2 years earlier. For 36 years, the BBC refused to broadcast repeats of The Goodies. The official response to fan requests was consistent and unambiguous. The corporation would remind inquirers, often curtly, that The Goodies had left the BBC. Bill Oddie has spoken about this directly and with considerable frustration. A show that had drawn 15 million viewers at its peak was kept off British television for nearly 4 decades because of a contractual grievance. The complete BBC collection only became available on DVD years later. The show finally became available on streaming platforms decades after it should have been. Fact 7. Bill Oddie was hospitalized 3 times for depression. This is the fact that changes how you see the show's history. Bill Oddie, the most musically gifted, the most physically energetic, the most publicly recognizable of the Goodies, was hospitalized 3 separate times during his life for clinical depression. He has spoken about this with considerable openness and honesty. His autobiography, One Flew into the Cuckoo's Egg, addresses his mental health directly. The man responsible for some of the most energetic physical comedy in British television history was simultaneously battling a condition that, at its worst, required hospitalization. His honesty about depression contributed significantly to wider public conversations about mental health in Britain, making him, in later life, an inadvertent advocate for something that had nothing to do with comedy and everything to do with courage. Fact 8. Tim Brooke-Taylor starred, alongside John Cleese. Before the Goodies, Tim Brooke-Taylor appeared in At Last, the 1948 show, a BBC sketch program that also featured John Cleese and Graham Chapman. 2 of the men who would go on to create Monty Python's Flying Circus shared a screen with one of the men who would create The Goodies years before either project existed. John Cleese paid tribute to Brooke-Taylor after his death, describing him as one of his very oldest friends and someone he had loved performing with. He had, Cleese said, done Frightened better than anyone. Eric Idle revealed that his own career had begun in 1963 when Brooke-Taylor auditioned him for a Footlights review. The man who became one of the Goodies helped launch the career of a man who became one of Monty Python. Fact 9. The show was huge in Australia and New Zealand. While the Goodies built a significant following in the UK, their international reach extended far beyond Britain, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, where the show developed a devoted fan base that in some ways exceeded their British popularity. Tim Brooke-Taylor had earned, in his agent's own words, household name status in Australia. Fans regularly stopped the surviving members in the street to tell them how they had grown up watching the show. Bill Oddie has responded to this warmth with characteristic directness, noting in his own words that no one who watched The Goodies ever grew up. He said it as a compliment. The Australian and New Zealand audiences tended to agree. Fact 10. Tim Brooke-Taylor had worked with Eric Idle before Footlights. The connections between The Goodies and the broader landscape of British comedy run deeper than most fans realize. Eric Idle has confirmed that it was Tim Brooke-Taylor who auditioned him for a Footlights review in 1963, effectively giving Idle his first significant break in comedy. Without that audition, the trajectory of one of Monty Python's most recognizable members might have been entirely different. The Goodies and Monty Python are often treated as entirely separate comedic universes. In reality, they shared personnel, shared roots, and shared a profound mutual respect that lasted for the rest of their lives. Fact 11. The giant kitten actually existed. One of the Goodies' most beloved moments involved Twinkle, a giant white kitten that grew to enormous size and toppled London's post office tower. The episode became one of the most talked about moments in the show's entire run. The production team built a practical giant kitten prop for filming. It was not purely a camera trick or an editing effect. There was an actual oversized feline prop on an actual London street being filmed by an actual camera crew for transmission on actual national television. This was the 1970s. The prop budget was apparently not a significant concern. Fact 12. Bill Oddie became one of Britain's most respected naturalists. After The Goodies ended in 1982, Bill Oddie's career took a direction that surprised many fans who only knew him as a comedian. Oddie had been a passionate birdwatcher and naturalist since childhood. After the show ended, he channeled this passion into a new career as a television presenter of wildlife documentaries, eventually becoming one of the most recognizable faces in British natural history, broadcasting through programs including Spring Watch, Autumn Watch, and Birding with Bill Oddie. The scruffy rebel from Lancashire, who had made millions laugh on a tandem bicycle, became, in his later years, a respected advocate for conservation and environmental causes. The comedy career and the naturalist career were not contradictions. They were, for Bill Oddie, simply different expressions of the same curiosity about the world. Fact 13. Graham Garden is still appearing on radio. Of the original 3 Goodies, only Graham Garden is still regularly performing in 2026. Now in his early 80s, Garden continues to appear as a panelist on BBC Radio 4's I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, the long-running comedy panel show that has featured him for decades. Tim Brooke-Taylor was also a regular panelist on I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue until his death in 2020. The show became, in later years, the primary ongoing creative home for 2 of the Goodies, a quieter, gentler comedy vehicle that nevertheless kept them in front of audiences for decades after the tandem had been retired. Fact 14. Tim Brooke-Taylor died on a Sunday morning in April 2020. On the 12th of April 2020, Tim Brooke-Taylor died. He was 79 years old. He had contracted COVID-19 during the early weeks of the pandemic. His agent's statement described a man who had given enormous pleasure across 6 decades of entertainment. Bill Oddie called him a true visual comic and a great friend, and added in a tribute that captured something essential about their relationship: "No one could wear silly costumes or do dangerous stunts like Tim. I know it hurt because he used to cry a lot. Sorry, Timbo." Graham Garden described him as a funny, sociable, generous man who was a delight to work with. Audiences found him not only hilarious but also adorable. John Cleese, Eric Idle, and comedians across generations paid tribute to a man whose career had touched almost every corner of British comedy for 60 years. The response from the public was immediate and overwhelming. An entire generation remembered all at once exactly what the Goodies had meant to them. Fact 15. Bill Oddie died in July 2026. And then, just weeks ago, the second Goodie was gone. Bill Oddie died in July 2026, at the age of 84. The man who had written the music, led the physical comedy, battled depression with extraordinary openness, and spent his later years fighting for the natural world he had loved since childhood, was gone. Graham Garden is now the last surviving Goodie. 3 men met at Cambridge. They built something together that made 15 million people laugh every week for over a decade. They fought with the BBC, left for ITV, got cancelled, and were buried for 36 years. And then the world remembered them again, first when Tim died, and then when Bill followed. The Goodies were doing anything, any place, anywhere, anytime. They always were, and those are 15 shocking facts about one of the most beloved, most underrated, and most unjustly forgotten comedy shows in British television history. If you grew up with the Goodies, this channel was made for you. Subscribe, and we will see you next time.